Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. Beneath the dust and marble of Rome's grandest stage where sunlight once gilded blood and sand, there was another world. A world of darkness, of wood and rope, of gears that turned in silence. And it all began with someone who did not choose to be there. You are looking down, now, past the broken teeth of time, into the gaping floor of the Colosseum. What you see today, stone walls, segmented pits, walkways exposed to the air, was once covered by a wooden arena floor, painted sand on top, traps and hatches below. But the skeleton beneath was once hidden. That skeleton had a name. The Romans called it the Hypogeum, from the Greek hypo, meaning under, and ge, meaning earth. It was a two-level maze of corridors, animal cages, elevators, trapdoors, and pulley systems. Built not in one go, but over decades, adjusted and repaired, retrofitted, finally abandoned. But someone had to imagine it first, and that person, according to a single, almost forgotten, marginal note in a 4th century Roman engineering manual, was not an architect from a noble family, nor an imperial engineer trained in Greek geometry. It was a slave, or more precisely, a captivist, a captive taken during war. His name might have been lost, but his mark, his method, remained etched in the underside of history. The Romans were methodical, but not always original. Much of their engineering came from others: Etruscan drains, Carthaginian siege machines, Greek water screws. The Colosseum itself, commissioned under Emperor Vespasian and completed under Titus around 80 CE, borrowed ideas from Greek amphitheaters, but nothing like the Hypogeum had existed before. Amphitheaters had no need for what was, essentially, an underground machine. The first games Venetians, the beast hunts, had been held on a flat floor. Animals were brought in before the crowd arrived. There was no element of surprise, no drama, but Roman crowds wanted more shock, more movement, more unpredictability. And so, sometime in the early 80s CE, under Emperor Domitian's reign, the order was given: build beneath the Colosseum, not add something, but bury something beneath it. And that's when a man nameless, invisible, enslaved, was handed the problem no one else wanted to solve. He had likely been taken in war, maybe from Judea, or Dacia, or Germania. His native language is unknown, but he was literate in technical Greek Rome's working language for mathematics and design, and he could draw, not draw art, draw systems. He knew how things moved, and why they broke. A centurion's report described him vaguely: the foreigner who makes machines with no handles. This may refer to his habit of using counterweights, hidden levers, or rotating pivots buried in walls, designs that allowed even untrained laborers to move heavy weights without visible effort. When shown the floor plan of the Colosseum, the story goes, he said nothing. He simply traced a spiral in the dust with his finger. Then he pointed downward. The concept was simple, but execution would be agonizing. What he envisioned was not a straight corridor, nor a network of tunnels, but a spiraling mechanism system that could bring beasts, gladiators, and props into the arena from below, in a way that felt invisible to the viewer. The Colosseum's oval shape made this uniquely challenging, because the underground space could not be uniform. The center had to be strongest, with pillars to support the wooden floor above. The outer areas needed to house winches, pulleys, animal pens, and ramps. So he did something the Romans rarely did. He bent their rectangles instead of strict grid layouts. He mapped curved tracks Not because it was beautiful, but because it was efficient. Curved channel could wrap around pillars, follow the stress lines of the architecture above, okay, and allow for carts to rotate in tight spaces. And that was the true innovation. Not the elevators, not the trapdoors, but the turning. You could turn a bear underground. You could turn a chariot without ever seeing it until it burst upward into the arena. And that was theater. That was fear. Slaves did the building, of course. Hundreds of them. Quarrymen, carpenters, rope makers, bricklayers. But the engineer, the unknown man, remained underground during construction. He was not free to leave, not even to stand in the sunlight above. He carved his plans into wet clay tiles, set out on the floor like a temporary mosaic. When the tiles dried, they were stacked and used again. None survive, but the layers of mortar in the Hypogeum show evidence of scratched markings. Deep and deliberate calculation marks, angle corrections, even some Greek letters. Most Romans carved nothing into construction. Mortars. These are working traces. The fingerprints of someone building by iteration, not blueprint. A mind trapped in stone. Solving puzzles under torchlight, and the problem was endless. Wood, warped. Ropes, frayed. Moisture from the nearby Cloaca Maxima Rome's ancient sewers seeped into the Hypogeum and made the machinery heavy. Slow, rot, dash-prone, so the engineer invented drainage grooves. They're still visible today. Tiny channels in the stone floor, slanted by degrees, so slight it would take your eyes hours to notice. But water noticed and moved away. The engineer also had to account for smell, animals, blood, decay. He borrowed ideas from bathhouses, air shafts, charcoal vents, limestone powder to absorb waste. The Colosseum's underground became, functionally, a hybrid of a prison, a stable, a warehouse, and a stage. And it worked, too. Well, the crowd no longer looked down into darkness. They looked into mystery, and they listened for the rattle of chains, the moan of a winch, the thud of something climbing from the earth. The engineer remained anonymous, but his work made the arena unforgettable. He did not win freedom. No record of him appears in manumission rolls, but one possible trace lingers. A tile fragment, now housed in a storage vault in the Museo Nazionale Romano, bears a strange stamp. It says only P per Greek, for I am here. Not a signature, a presence, a defiance, perhaps, or a mark of survival. And when you stand above the Hypogeum today, when you look down into that damp, fractured tangle of corridors and stones, you are not seeing ruins. You are seeing a mind trapped in engineering. A person whose hands could not hold freedom, but who held geometry. And geometry, unlike names, can last 2,000 years. But if this person built the system, who maintained it? And how long could such a machine keep functioning in a space so hidden from the sun? And why, in the records of later emperors, do we find sudden and unexplained notes about subterranean failures during games? By the time the applause died and the crowd shuffled out through the arches of the Colosseum, the real work had only just begun. What lay beneath the arena was not a single structure, but a living, groaning machine, and someone had to keep it breathing. You're standing now, not in the daylight, but in the low, choking dark beneath the floorboards. There is no sand down here, no cheering, just grease and silence, and a steady, rhythmic creak of ropes tightening overnight. The Hypogeum, Rome's secret masterpiece, was never designed to rest. Every morning, its elevators had to be primed, cages realigned, counterweights recalibrated, water bailed, pulleys rethreaded. And no one above was ever meant to notice. And those who worked down here, they had names, though few were written down. But their lives were hidden on purpose, because nobody wanted to remember the keepers of the underground. Let's begin with the rope, a Roman Carcesium, a block and tackle system required specific maintenance. Hemp ropes would stretch and shrink with weather, to taut, and they'd snap, to slack, and they'd stall mid-lift. The elevators of the Hypogeum, some 24 of them, by the 2nd century CE were powered by manually operated winches, each one operated by up to 8 men. These were not simple pulleys, but hybrid lifting platforms. Each had to hold the full weight of a live beast or, in some cases, a wooden set piece that mimicked temples, ships, or hillsides. Each platform was guided by vertical grooves carved into stone, reinforced with wooden sliders to reduce friction. And if one guide rail broke, the entire load could collapse. There are ancient repair notches in several foundation stones that suggest this happened often, so the keepers of the Hypogeum, often slaves, sometimes freedmen, rarely named, had one of the most complex maintenance jobs in ancient Rome. They were part carpenter, part mechanic, part animal handler, part janitor. They oiled wooden beams with lard. They wound ropes in layered loops to spread wear. They filed grooves into bronze wheels to keep them smooth. And, above all, they remembered by hand, not book, how every elevator differed from the others, because each one was unique, each slightly warped, each idiosyncratic. The Hypogeum was not a factory. It was a patchwork. The job was dangerous. Wooden beams could splinter. Lifting platforms could fall. Some early systems had no mechanical brakes, only men with wedges, jamming them into wheels mid-spin. And as the underground floor swelled in, complexity, animal pens, trap corridors, slave tunnels, so too did the likelihood of accidents. There is no complete record of fatalities, but one 3rd century inscription found near the Ludus Magnus, the largest gladiator training school nearby, mentions a man named Silvanus. It reads, "Silvanus, keeper of ropes, crushed by descent, remembered by his brother." That's all. No statue, no portrait, just the memory of being crushed by descent. And so they worked in shifts. Morning crews would prepare the systems for opening. Midday crews ran the lifts during the games. And the night crews, those who were often invisible, even to other slaves, did repairs and resets. These men moved through torchlit shafts beneath the cheering of 50,000 spectators above, hearing the crowd only as a distant pulse, like waves through stone. Then there was the water problem. Rome's underground was never truly dry. The Colosseum was built on a drained section of Nero's artificial lake. And though the Romans had good drainage engineering, time, earthquakes, seasonal flooding often disrupted the balance. Archaeological surveys of the Hypogeum have found layers of lime, sediment, and charcoal at intervals. Lime was used to neutralize smell. Charcoal absorbed moisture and rot. Buckets would be stationed in corners. Drains would be cleared manually. Sometimes, entire sections of floor had to be reinforced with new beams, raising the underground corridors by inches every decade. This meant that the Hypogeum was not only maintained, was rebuilt. Over and over, from within. No modern blueprint could ever capture the way it changed. It evolved through necessity, a constantly modified machine. Then came the animals. They were not caged politely. They were angry, drugged, hungry, injured, confused. Lions, leopards, bears, crocodiles, even ostriches and elephants, depending on the spectacle. Keeping them underground for hours, sometimes days, required dark pens, strong gates, quiet passageways, and constant supervision. The slaves who handled them had to memorize which creatures needed calming, which could not be let near each other, which would be coaxed by meat, and which would die if the elevator jammed too long in the summer heat. Some pens had slanted floors. This wasn't designed. Flared was hygiene. Sloped floors allowed waste to drain away more easily. Other pens had bone fragments embedded in the corners, likely from fights or feeding. You can imagine the smell. No one above ever spoke of it. The machinery groaned more loudly during summer. Wood expanded. Heat made ropes brittle. During August games, especially under Commodus, who loved theatrical excess, more props were added, more platforms, more animals, more chaos. Failures began to occur. Records from this period include vague notations in annals and letters. The beast failed to rise. Delay in the pit. Interruption. Crowd displeased. This was not just a technical issue, it was a political failure. The Hypogeum was expected to deliver fear on cue. When it didn't, someone got punished. That someone was never the emperor in the year 217 CE. The Colosseum caught fire, not from sabotage, likely from lightning striking the top tier's wooden seating. The blaze reached the machinery below, and just like that, the Hypogeum, centuries in the making, was scorched, but not erased. Brick tunnels survived, stone pillars cracked but held, and over the next decades, pieces of it were rebuilt, but never the whole. The knowledge was fragmenting. The people who remembered how it all worked, the silent engineers and keepers, were gone, and without memory, no machine can function forever. By the 5th century, the Colosseum had stopped hosting animal shows. By the 6th, the arena was repurposed for housing, workshops, even churches. The Hypogeum became a cellar, a dump, a forgotten riddle of ramps and staircases, no longer needed. Moss grew on the elevator shafts. The rope guides rotted, keyed into slush. Dust sealed what was once the breath of the arena, and no one drew a diagram of what had once been done down there. The Hypogeum died, not in a fire, but in silence. And yet, a few notes lingered in Vitruvius' architectural manuals, in Pliny's natural history, in carved graffiti. Deep under the seating levels, where someone scrawled a diagram that doesn't match any known surface structure. It shows a circle within a circle, lines drawn like spokes, small rectangles beside them. Not art, not decoration, but a memory into stone, because paper would not survive. A memory of a mechanism, a system that lifted terror, into daylight. But what happens when such a machine is left to collapse? What stories do the stones still remember, long after the gears have stopped? When the machinery stopped, when the animals were no longer caged, and the gates no longer slammed upward on cue, when the Colosseum became a ruin rather than a performance hall. The underground did not vanish, it slept, and below the layers of brick and silence, past the years of rubble and repurposed marble, past the centuries of repaving and re-roofing and reusing, something was left. Something drawn by hand, by someone who was never meant to be remembered. Let's go back not to the 5th century, not to the 3rd, but to the 1st, when the arena was new, when the floors still smelled of shaved wood and wax oil, when Rome was solidifying not just its empire, but its image. The Colosseum didn't build itself, nor was it simply a command of emperors or a marvel of engineering theory. Every gear, plank, peg, rope, and groove had to be measured before it was lifted. It had to be drawn, and some quiet, probably enslaved artisan had to draft the Hypogeum. We don't know his name. He wasn't mentioned in dedicatory plaques or inscribed on lintels. But what we do know comes from something found beneath a collapsed stairwell during 19th century excavations. A series of burnt lines, faint, etched into a slab of reused travertin, no labels, no stylus marks, but unmistakable. A floor plan, not of the entire Colosseum, just one section, a half circle of rectangles, parallel lines suggesting guides, arcs showing motion. There's no signature, but the ash stains that coated tell a quiet story. The stone had been used as a drawing surface, possibly charcoal, possibly ash mixed with water. And when the Hypogeum burned in 217 CE, this stone part of an interior stairwell was buried under debris. It survived, and centuries later, when archaeologists puzzled over it, some dismissed it as meaningless scribbles. Others thought it a child's diagram. But a few engineer specialists in ancient mechanics, something else. It was a blueprint, crude, unlabeled, but functionally precise. The angles matched known elevator shafts. The grooves corresponded to the platform tracks. The spacing fit the known layout of the surviving Hypogeum tunnels, which means someone, long ago, thought spatially about this machine. Not just how to lift or lower animals, not how to coordinate space. Sequence, weight, force. Why would a slave need to draw something? Because memory fails. K. And because standardization was impossible in the underground. K. Every shaft was slightly different, carved in response to the terrain or adjusted during hurried construction. Perhaps the enslaved engineer had overseen multiple lift platforms. Perhaps he'd learned from trial and error that what worked in shaft 7 jammed in shaft 8. So he sketched it, not to impress, but to remember. And once the sketch served its purpose, it was abandoned. The slab reused, built into a wall, hidden under steps. A drawing made not for glory, but survival. Let's talk about the knowledge that doesn't get written down. When we think of Roman engineering, we often think of aqueducts, domes, roads, and massive public buildings. Great marvels that made it into textbooks. But most ancient engineering was unwritten, passed hand to hand, from laborer to apprentice, from builder to builder, and especially among slaves, who were denied formal education. Everything had to be stored in gesture, repetition, and the occasional hidden mark, a notch on wood, a gouge in brick, a diagram in ashdot. These were functional literacies, silent codes passed among the invisible class that kept the city running. So when we say a slave drew a blueprint, we are saying that an entire world of undocumented expertise once existed beneath the arena floor. And when the Colosseum began to crumble, it wasn't just stones that collapsed, it was a loss of memory. The Hypogeum was sealed off for centuries. Grass grew over the arena floor. The shafts filled with mud. In medieval times, the underground chambers were used for storage. In the Renaissance, pilgrims mistook the ruins for a site of Christian martyrdom. No one remembered how the lifts had worked. No one remembered the names of the men who built them. But when 19th century engineers lowered themselves into the still damp pits beneath the arena, they found something unexpected. Mechanical patterns, guides, rails, pivots, and shafts. It was as though the arena had kept its secrets by becoming too boring to record. But the stones themselves remembered. You can still see the notches where wheels once turned, still feel the polished wear of beams that slid back and forth under pressure, still smell, faintly, the mineral bite of old oil, cooked into the limestone by centuries of heat, even without the full machinery, even without the ropes or wood. The Hypogeum tells its story. If you listen, in 2000, archaeologists uncovered a section of the Hypogeum that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Inside, they found traces of animal pens, feed troughs, and narrow crawl spaces too small for adults to navigate easily. Some believed these spaces were for adolescent workers, boys, or small-framed men used to shimmy between shafts during maintenance. Others suggest these were emergency tunnels used when mechanisms jammed and someone had to manually dislodge a pulley or reset a wedge. Either way, reveals this: the Hypogeum was a place of constant movement, constant improvisation, and constant risk. No wonder the men who worked it needed their own codes, drawings, and diagrams, small marks of memory in a place that offered no pause. What became of the man who drew that floor plan? Did he die in the fire? Was he reassigned to another construction site? Did he pass his knowledge down to someone else, whispering it during the rare, quiet hours between games? We don't know. but his hand lingers in the curve of those etched lines, in the logic of the drawing, in the quiet mastery of space that it represents. The blueprint in ash is not famous. It's not displayed in a grand museum, but it may be the only surviving schematic of how Rome's greatest spectacle worked, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, from underground, from the invisible world. And perhaps that's the real story of the Hypogeum, that even at the peak of Rome's vanity and violence, beneath the roar of emperors and the clash of gladiators, it was the unseen, the unnamed, and the forgotten who made the empire run, not the ones in marble, but the ones with soot on their hands, the ones who drew the machines in ash, in the quiet moments before a spectacle, when the crowd still filed into the upper tiers of the Flavian amphitheater, and the sun hovered low over the tiled skyline of Rome. There was a different kind of noise, underfoot, a faint tension, a groaning pool, a whispered command between men who stood in darkness. It wasn't the gladiators who moved first. It wasn't the musicians, or the announcers, or even the heralds in bronze-trimmed cloaks. It was the crew under the stage, down there beneath the carefully rigged sand of the arena floor. A labyrinth of passageways buzzed with activity that no audience would ever see, and then, at some predetermined signal, perhaps a horn blast, perhaps a choreographed shift in the arena music, it would happen. A platform would rise, not by magic, not by steam, not by levers alone, but by brute force, balance, and timing. A dozen men pulling a series of ropes in perfect unison, winding them around hand-turned capstans, sending an elevator up through the earth, and atop that elevator, a lion pacing nervously in a wooden cage, or a bear, or a panther, or, on some days, a full-grown elephant. It was one of Rome's most baffling inventions, a stage lift centuries ahead of its time, not powered by engines, not supported by pistons, but crafted with wedges, pulleys, grease, and rope. Each system bespoke a particular Roman genius, an obsession with control over spectacle, and a willingness to engineer even the invisible. But the truth is, the lift didn't just rise, it roared. The crowd might not have heard it, masked by cheers or the stomp of sandaled feet, but below, the Hypogeum rumbled with sound grinding, creaking, ropes stretching taut, the friction of fibers tugging over bronze and wood. It was as if the very ground growled before unleashing its fury. And that was the point. For Romans, nothing was accidental, not even surprise. The engineering of the lift system, known today simply as the Hypogeum elevators, was a carefully calculated illusion. The platform had to appear at the right moment, at the right angle, at just the right speed, fast enough to be thrilling, slow enough to maintain control, because what was being lifted wasn't scenery. It was danger. To understand how this worked, you need to forget what you know about modern elevators. There were no counterweights. There was no single shaft. Instead, imagine a system of trapdoors, perhaps 24 or more, each about the size of a small wagon, embedded within the arena floor. Each trapdoor had its own platform beneath, waiting in the gloom. Each platform had a crew anywhere, from 4 to 16 men, solely to its mechanism. At the core of the mechanism was a wooden stuna, vertical axle surrounded by 4 or more spokes, like a ship's steering wheel. Men would walk in circles, pushing these spokes around. As they turned, thick ropes would wrap around the core, pulling the elevator platform upward. The platform itself was guided by vertical rails, ensuring it didn't tilt or wobble. The ropes had to be perfectly even, too much slack on one side, and the cage might tip out to reduce friction. The ropes and rails were greased regularly, animal fat, most likely lathered on by hand. The timing of these lifts was critical. If one platform rose even a few seconds too soon, I could ruin the entire dramatic sequence above. That's why a coordinator, possibly a freedman trained in stage mechanics, stood at the center of the Hypogeum floor. His job wasn't just to signal, it was to count, to keep track of dozens of moving parts in the dark by torchlight, and ensured that when the line emerged, it emerged exactly when the Emperor raised his hand. But let's pause for a moment. Let's imagine what it felt like to be one of the rope men. You worked underground. There was no fresh air, no view of the games, no recognition from the stands. You trained for months to coordinate your movements with your fellow laborers, stepping in rhythm, pulling in rhythm, stopping on cue. Some say the crews were chosen for their uniform size, so that no one man threw off the balance of the lift. You learned to recognize the feel of resistance in the rope, whether it meant the cage was stuck or whether the animal had lunged. You knew that if a platform jammed mid-ascent, it had to be forced back down manually. That if a rope snapped, the drop could kill whatever or whoever was inside. And yet, you had no gloves, no mechanical brakes, only rhythm, muscle, practice, and probably fear. The Hypogeum elevators weren't static structures. They evolved over time. Under Emperor Domitian, Titus Flavius Domitianus, who reigned from 81 to 96 CE, the underground was expanded and formalized. Before Domitian, the Colosseum's substructure was simpler storage tunnels, animal pens, preparation zones, but Domitian, obsessed with theater and spectacle, ordered a complete overhaul. Dozens of elevators were added, tunnels were reinforced, and the synchronization system was refined, perhaps inspired by water organs and theatrical machines already in use in other Roman venues. Some archaeologists believe the Colosseum's trapdoor system may have drawn from innovations used in Greek, Scaean stage buildings and hell mounts, mechanical openings used in religious theater, but Rome, as always, scaled it up. Where a Greek play might reveal one character with a trapdoor, Rome revealed 20 beasts at once. And here's the twist. The animals often had no idea where they were. They'd been kept in darkness for days, in narrow pens beneath the arena. When the platform began to rise, they could sense the motion, hear the roar of the crowd, feel the draft of air, and when the trapdoor opened, when sunlight hit their eyes, they bolted forward. Not from rage, from panic, and the crowd would cheer, never knowing how carefully that panic had been arranged. Dozens of lifts meant dozens of variations. Some platforms had rotating mechanisms, allowing handlers to spin the cage to face the audience. Others included tilt functions, drop in the front of the cage to let animals leap out without injuring themselves. There were also false lifts, empty platforms raised as decoys to surprise or confuse the audience. We even have evidence of scenery platforms once that rose not with animals, but with rocks, trees, or props to simulate an African or Eastern landscape, and all of it was powered by people. No steam, no hydraulics, just the steady strength of laborers who walked in circles, who hoisted ropes, who reset gears, who knew the feel of the machine in their bones. It's a kind of knowledge that doesn't leave records, but it leaves signs, notches in stone, smooth grooves in otherwise rough floors, splinters of rope wear. Grease preserved the fibers, and sometimes, if you're quiet enough, leaves sound and echo beneath the earth, a memory of the elevator that roared. If you were standing on the arena floor of the Colosseum, sand under your feet, the roar of 50,000 voices rippling like fabric overhead, you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't feel the shift. But below you, a mechanism was moving. It did not hum like modern machines. It had no lights, no blinking indicators, no sleek casing or polished steel. It was wood and sinew and tension. It was Roman engineering, not meant to be admired, only obeyed. Down below, in the half-light of flickering torches and echoing footsteps, the Colosseum's subterranean world unfolded like an invisible city. The Hypogeum, as it is now called, was not a single chamber, but a grid of narrow corridors, animal pens, lift shafts, staging rooms, and capsting platforms all meticulously aligned to the floor plan above. This was not chaos beneath beauty. It was symmetry beneath spectacle. But symmetry does not mean silence. The men assigned to this world below had no audience, but they had a script. Every pull, every turn of the wheel, every muscle twitch was part of a silent choreography. 'Cause if one platform failed, the illusion above collapsed. The ancient sources don't name these workers. No tablets record their stories. We know them only through the archaeological shadows they left behind. Deep in the Hypogeum, you might notice grooves worn into the wooden floorboards, long, shallow arcs etched by decades of footfalls walking, endless circles around CAPSTANS dot in some corners. Archaeologists have uncovered dark stains in the stone traces of animal fat and olive oil, likely used to lubricate pulleys and wheels. On walls, iron eyelets remain embedded, used to anchor ropes or guide tension through carefully plotted paths. There are slots carved into pillars, almost too narrow to notice, which once held sliding wooden guide tracks for the vertical rails that kept the elevator straight, and every piece, every beam, rope, and rung had to endure not just weight, but movement, because, unlike a modern freight elevator, the Roman lift did not glide. It strained, it resisted, it growled through effort, and it had to reset again and again, sometimes 50 times in a single day. Some scholars argue that the Colosseum's elevators were among the most advanced mechanical stagecraft in the ancient world, because they were complex, but because they worked reliably under stress. A typical animal cage could weigh several hundred kilograms even before its occupant was added. A lion, roughly 180 kilograms. A bear, more. And the largest spectacle animals, elephants, or exotic imports from Nubiak, push a total platform weight over 1,000 kilograms, lifting that weight vertically through a shaft of wood, coal, and stone required capstans at the right ratio of torque to human force, greased pulley wheels to minimize friction, a locking system, often wooden pegs slotted into toothed beams to hold the platform in place between poles, ropes made from tightly twisted linen, hemp, or animal sinew, thick as a man's wrist. One question that lingers is how long it took to raise a platform, based on surviving reconstructions and experimental archaeology. Some scholars estimate that it took 6 to 8 men around 15 seconds to raise a single elevator, the full height roughly 6 meters from the Hypogeum to the arena floor. But this assumes perfect coordination, real conditions, slipping rope, frightened animals. Communication could delay the process. That's why, beneath the ground, there were directors. We don't know their names, but we know their tools: short sticks, wax tablets, flint clickers, and whistles, methods of signaling in the dark. Each crew likely had a lead worker, someone trained not just in physical effort, but in mechanical understanding. Imagine, for a moment, how it must have felt to stand in that chamber. Torchlight flutters across stone and rope. The air smells of sweat, oil, and the sour fear of caged animals. You've been walking circles around a capstan all morning, pausing only when the floor handler tells you to. Then the signal comes. The rope tugs. You plant your feet. You lean your shoulders into the bar. And, slowly, painfully, the platform creaks upward. You do not know what animal is inside. You may never see it, but you feel its weight through the rope. We often think of Roman spectacle as violent, theatrical, larger dash than dash life. And it was. But it was also mechanical. The drama above could not unfold without the predictability below. Each gladiatorial fight, each dramatic release of animals, each sudden emergence of trees, rocks, enemy soldiers, through trapdoors, all of it required machines. And yet, None of those machines survive. The lifts were made of wood, held together with rope bindings and iron nails, and operated with tools of grease, wedge, hand muscle. Wood decays. Rope rots. What remains is stone and silence. But silence can still speak if you know how to listen. In 1938, and again in the 1950s, major excavations under the Colosseum revealed dozens of vertical shafts, some round, some square-cut trimmed with rail slots and inset pulley holes. Traces of burnt wood and iron pins marked where capstans had once stood. Some walls bore the dark outline of arch-shaped doorways, now sealed. These were the gates to the unknown too, rooms from which cages once rolled, lifted into view, and then vanished again. We don't know how many lifts the final version of the Colosseum had. Some scholars estimate 28 elevators. Others suggest as many as 60, scattered across both sides of the arena's central spine. What's more intriguing is that not all elevators were for animals. Some were used for scenery, fake boulders, potted palms, even mechanical statues that rotated or shifted pose as they rose. Others were used for actors' mythical reenactments of gods emerging from the underworld. In these cases, the elevator had to rise slowly, even gracefully, to preserve the illusion. Some elevators may have been disguised with trapdoor lids, so finely crafted that, when closed, they were invisible to the audience. And below, the same mechanics remained: wood, rope, muscle. Modern reconstructions of these elevators, such as the work done during the early 2000s for exhibition purposes, have helped scholars test their theories using surviving Hypogeum shafts and ancient engineering texts like Vitruvius's De Architectura. Teams have rebuilt functioning wooden lifts, operated manually with capstans and rails. The results: it works, painfully, reliably, just as it would have 2,000 years ago. But these experiments also expose just how fragile the system could be. A rope worn through by friction, a loose pulley bracket, a misaligned guide rail. Any of these could jam the system or topple the platform. That's why regular maintenance was part of the routine. Cater, crew, perhaps freedman trained in stagecraft, was responsible for checking every joint, every rope, every track before the day's games. They worked through the night, oiled the shafts, checked for frayed cords, listened for irregular squeaks. The audience never knew, but if something went wrong, the entire illusion shattered. And in a city where illusion and power walked hand in hand, that simply wasn't allowed. Still, there's something poetic in the way the Romans built their wonders: above ground, noise, drama, color; below ground, quiet coordination, endless repetition. The grind of rope over bronze, two worlds, one unseen, one unforgettable. And yet, both were machinery, living, breathing systems of human will applied to wood, and grease, and timing. So the next time you picture a lion bursting into the Colosseum, jaws wide, claws scraping the sand, picture the hands that raised it, the sweat that slicked the rope, the grease that stained the capstan wheel, and the silence that returned after the platform sank again, readying itself for the next roar. Because history's greatest illusions were not built to be admired. They were built to be believed. The sun moves slowly over the Colosseum, and with it, the weight of the day changes. By late afternoon, the cheers above have dulled into a sort of rhythmic hum. Tired, sunburnt citizens, shifting in their stone seats, shaded now by the massive canvas awning, the velarium drawn overhead like the wing of a resting bird. But below, the heat does not subside. The torches are still burning. The oil is still warm. The wooden wheels, slick with grease, have never stopped turning, because the final act is near, and the final lift must go perfectly. If you were standing in the Hypogeum in the last hour of a Roman spectaculum, you would hear none of the triumphant horns or dramatic narrations echoing above. Down here, sound behaves differently. The arena is porous, but selectively. Voices filter down in tones and vibrations, not in language. The workers in the shafts don't know if the crowd is cheering for a successful execution or a dramatic reenactment of a mythological hunt. They only know it's almost time. The supervisor walks with a torch along the track lines, tapping a staff against the wooden beams, not for show, but to check for hollow spots or cracks. A change in pitch means something is wrong. Softened thud signals water damage. A higher ring means the rope may be too tight. Every detail must be correct, because this lift, this is the one that carries the surprise. A rhinoceros, maybe, or a collection of 3 snarling leopards released in synchronized motion. Or worse, an actor dressed as a condemned figure from Orpheus, perhaps about to be torn apart for poetic effect. And, unlike the beasts, the actor knows what's coming. What makes the Colosseum's lift system so striking is not only its existence, but the precision of its misdirection. It was, in effect, a system designed to be invisible from the floor of the arena. The lifts were disguised by trapdoors, many of them set flush into the surface and covered with carefully tamped sand. The hinges were hidden. The seams were masked by decorative patterns. Some trapdoors, according to reconstructions, opened vertically, splitting down the middle. Others swung out in pairs or lifted completely off to the side. Each design served a different narrative purpose. The trapdoor that mimicked a cave for releasing lions might open slowly, with a creak. The one meant to resemble a mythical underworld gate might rise vertically, allowing actors or stage props to seem as if they were floating up from the depths. All this required engineering, but also storytelling in essence. Roman stage crew were illusionists. They knew that lifting an animal through a hole in the floor could be frightening, but lifting it without being noticed until it was already among the people, that was power. It's no accident that many Roman emperors saw the games not just as entertainment, but as a form of statecraft, to demonstrate control over nature, over lions, bears, elephants, condemned criminals, gods, myths, foreign captives was, to demonstrate control over everything, and that control was exercised, by rope. When archaeologists first studied the layout of the Hypogeum, they expected simplicity, a few ramps, maybe some storage. But what they found was a system so dense, so repetitive, that it resembled the foundations of a factory. Each elevator shaft was flanked by its own operating station, where capstans were installed. These were heavy wooden posts, mounted horizontally, turned by walking in circles around them, while pulling a lever or pushing a beam. Some elevators had 2 capstans per shaft, one for lifting, the other for lowering in case of a jam. Each lift also required guides, vertical runners along which the platform moved, preventing it from swinging or twisting during ascent. The lifts had to remain perfectly balanced, even while carrying a live animal or worse, several. That's where the platform design came in. Roman elevators were not open baskets, but reinforced crates with side rails and wooden crossbeams. These served 2 purposes. They kept the animal from escaping, and they helped distribute the weight evenly so that no corner rose faster than the others. If a lift tilted, it could catch on the shaft walls and splinter. If it stuck halfway up, the entire event paused. No one wanted that. One of the most surprising things about these lifts is how quiet they were relative to their function. Despite the wood friction, the Roman crews used a variety of techniques to reduce sound. Animal fat and olive oil were poured into small grooves carved into pulley tracks, reducing squeaks. Waxed rope helped soften tension snaps and jerks. Cloth padding was sometimes used at the base of shafts to muffle noise. All of this mattered because, while the lifts were roaring in effort, the crowd was watching the stage, not the floor. Surprise was the point. A beast should not be heard before it was seen. An actor should not be known before they emerged. In a moment of terror engineered through rope and grease should arrive like thunder after silence. There is a theory among some modern scholars that theatrical engineers, the machinators, as they were sometimes called, held a special place in Roman society. Not quite slaves, not quite citizens, but specialists. Their domain was not politics or war, but deception. They created the illusions that held the empire together, not just in the Colosseum, but in theaters, temples, and victory parades. Some of them may have passed their secrets down through families, generations of lift builders and rope splicers who never saw the light of day, but knew how to bring it into the arena. And in that sense, they weren't laborers. They were storytellers, unseen, unnamed, but absolutely essential. As the sun fell low over Rome and the final lift of the day began its rise, the air in the Hypogeum would still with tension. Up above, sand was brushed lightly aside by stagehands. The trapdoor was tested once, twice a whistle signaled readiness. The capstan crew took their places, and slowly, the ropes pulled taut. A pulley turned. The gear clicked. The lift began to move, not with speed, not with silence, but with purpose. It reached the top. The trapdoors parted, and in the blinding light of afternoon, a creature stepped into history, not because of what it was, but because of how it arrived. No one remembers the names of those who lifted the last rhinoceros into the Colosseum. No records remain of the man who oiled the final rope, or the woman who pounded the wedge into place before the wheel turned. But their work survives in grooves, in burned residue in the shadows beneath stone and sand. And perhaps that is enough, because every illusion requires a hidden hand, and every roar, a silence behind it, beneath the arena's golden dust. Under the crushed bones and dried blood of countless games ran a system so vital to the Colosseum's rhythm that, without it, the entire amphitheater would have stopped breathing. It wasn't just the elevators, or the trapdoors, or the pulleys tied to creaking beams. It was the humans, the ones assigned not to the spectacle, but to the silence, the ones who worked at the dark cells. They had no names, or at least not ones recorded in marble. No busts, no statues, no praise and poetry, But the Roman Empire depended on people like this, people whose purpose was not to entertain, or even to be seen. They were custodes subterranea, wardens of the underground. If you had walked through the Hypogeum in the 2nd century Adena as a guest or a gladiator, but as one of the staff, you might have been greeted not by voices, but by the clang of gates. The air was different here, wet with condensation and heavier than the open streets of Rome, mixed with dung, sweat, rotting wood, and the faint iron scent of shackles. Cells lined the stone walls, carved with utilitarian intent. Some were large enough to hold an elephant. Others were barely wide enough for a person to sit. The wardens lived among them, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. Their sleeping quarters were tucked beside the pens, separated only by wood partitions or rough brick. Some were elevated, allowing them to peer down into the cells they guarded. Most had no more than a straw mat, a clay oil lamp, and a few tool skis, chains, feed buckets, sharpened poles. These were the instruments of control, but also of survival, because the animals weren't tame, and neither were the humans. Wardens were expected to manage both. One day, a lion recently arrived from Mauritania, pacing in frustration after weeks in a cramped transport cage. The next day, a condemned prisoner from Daisa, kept alive just long enough to be thrown to the beasts for a Venecio spectacle, hunt, and always the gladiators. Some were professionals with reputations and rituals. Others were prisoners pressed into service, half-starved and full of rage. The warden's job was not to care. It was to maintain order to keep the breathing separated from the bleeding, to make sure the arena floor had its performers when the gate opened, nothing more. We imagine the Colosseum as a monument to violence, and it was. But it was also a monument to timing that animals needed to be alive, but not wild. The gladiators needed to be ready, but not dead. The prisoners needed to be terrified, but not broken. The only way that happened was if someone down below managed the logistics of fear. This required knowledge not of philosophy or law but of motion. A lion takes 7 days to recover from the sea journey, and if it's hungry too soon, it will bite at the wooden gate. A bear grows anxious if it hears human voices too often, but comes with silence and darkness. A Nubian gladiator, trained by the Ludus Magnus across the road, will not speak, but he will obey if handed a ceremonial coin before battle. He will toss it in the dust. That is his ritual. The wardens learned these things over time, not from scrolls, but from scars. Many of the custodies were former soldiersmen who had seen violence, not for entertainment, but for empire. Others were born into the work, sons of attendants or laborers attached to the Amphitheatrum Flavium, as the Colosseum was officially named. Some were even former prisoners men who had survived a sentence underground and found they had nowhere else to go. What united them was not honor or even payment. It was proximity. They were close to power. They saw the Munera unfold from beneath, heard the emperor's voice filter down through the sand, watched slaves carry messages with seals bearing the imperial eagle. They knew the rhythms of Rome more intimately than any senator, and yet they remained faceless because nobody applauded the man who latched the gate before a beast entered. No, one cheered for the hand that poured water on a gladiator's shoulder an hour before the match. But still, the hand had to be there when archaeologists first began mapping the Hypogeum's corridors in the 19th century. They were surprised by the symmetry. The system wasn't chaotic. It was planned. Stone corridors radiated from central spines. Cells were placed with intention, not just for storage, but for movement. There were designated lanes for animal keepers, for gladiator handlers, for warden patrols. Some walls had scratches. Others had chalk-marked symbols, directions, reminders, in the form of lines and crosses. And a few had something even stranger, deeply scored notches. It's almost like tally marks, with someone counting days, prisoners, victories, or perhaps something quieter, like how many times they survived the night. Because nights in the Hypogeum were the true test of the wardens, when the arena above was dark, and the citizens of Rome returned to their insulae, and the gladiators slumped into straw. There were still noises, not just from the animals, but from the architecture itself. Wood shrinks as it cools. Rope stretches. Iron contracts. The elevators shift in their slots. Rats scurry in forgotten alcoves. Bats flutter against torchlit ceilings. And sometimes there are whispers, not of ghosts, not myths, but men. Some condemned, whispering prayers. Some awaiting release, whispering names, and the wardens must walk through it all. Oil lamp in hand, keyring swaying at the hip, checking locks by memory, counting heads, making sure that the machinery around the part no one sees does not fail. They are not heroes. They are not villains. They are the invisible infrastructure of entertainment. One of the most telling discoveries made during a modern restoration was a small inscription carved in the soft mortar near one of the corner posts. It read, simply, Vigilavi ex annos. I kept watch 10 years. No name, no flourish. Just a record of time survived. It was carved low, barely at knee height, as if the man who wrote it did so while sitting, resting against a wall during a break in the patrol. 10 years in the dark. 10 years listening to the arena without seeing. 10 years making sure others met their fate. On time, it's easy to forget those lives when we talk about Rome. But perhaps that's what makes them important, because behind every spectacle, someone whose job is not to be remembered, only to make sure the memory happens, even if they remain neath it. As the lantern sputtered and the final clink of coins echoed above ground, after the last spectators staggered out of the vomitoria of the Colosseum, a different kind of activity stirred in the Hypogeum. It was not louder, just slower. The wardens, now free from the scurrying of runners, animal trainers, and sweating carpenters, began their second shift, the shift no one above mentioned, the one that had no scheduled end and no applause. You could hear it if you were still, the quiet hiss of oil being poured into a rusted hinge, Kika, a feeding hatch being opened just enough to slide in food to an animal you dared not see, the sigh of an old man lowering himself onto a stone slab to sleep a few hours beside the cage of a leopard brought from the media. In these hours, the hierarchy of Rome was reversed. Above, senators and soldiers walked in measured grandeur. Below, the line between jailer and prisoner thinned, because the wardens were not protected, they were not watched, and they were not remembered. Only each other knew. They existed. Each warden was assigned a corridor. These assignments were known by nods, by routines, by memory. No marble plaque declared who belonged where. There was no shift roster etched into copper or scratched into a wax tablet. A man simply walked the same path every day, till he couldn't. Then another man took his place. There were no promotions, no retirement, just aging joints and quiet replacements. Their pay was irregular, barely more than a laborer's daily wage. Most made extra coin by doing things off the record sharpening glady for a lanista, delivering messages for a sponsor, or collecting meat scraps for Bacali butchers. But they never left their post entirely, because you couldn't. The Hypogeum wasn't a place you simply worked. It was a place that absorbed you, not because it was evil, but because it was needed. There are scattered references brief, cry, half forgotten of the men who worked beneath the arena. Key, in a letter by Pliny the Younger, he mentions the sweaty handlers of beasts who never see the sun. In a ledger recovered near the Ludus Dazicus, one payment was listed for services rendered in the lowest chambers. But most of what we know comes not from words, but from where. Deep grooves in the stone floor mark the repetitive steps taken along certain paths. Stains on low ceilings, just generations of smoke from poorly trimmed lamps. Scratches in door frames show where keys were tested 1,000 times until the teeth finally wore smooth. And, most notably, the HANTPRINTS in at least 7 locations of the Hypogeum's preserved corridors. Archaeologists have found faded red or brown marks, sometimes just one, sometimes a cluster pressed into the lime-washed walls. They're not ceremonial. They're not decorative. They're fingerprints, smudged by time, but deliberate. It's as if the men who lived in that dark wanted to say, in the simplest way possible, I was here. The wardens often formed quiet alliances, not official, not public, but functional. An older man might take a younger assistant under his wing, teaching him how to calm a wild boar with water instead of force, how to open a gate slowly so it didn't startle the panther, how to bind a prisoner's wrists so circulation didn't cut off. Before the main event, there was no training manual, no orientation scroll dot. The learning came from surviving the mistakes of others, and the price of error was never mild. A misjudged lion could break through a wooden pen. A gladiator, misread, might snap a chain and bolt before dawn. One night, according to the account of a 3rd century funerary inscription found outside the Esquiline Gate, a man named Titus Rufillus died not in war nor peace, but at duty beneath the Flavian stage. The cause is never named, but the implication is clear. The dangers of the underground were real and constant, and they had no audience. Food was delivered once a day, usually in bulk baskets lowered down by slaves employed not by the Colosseum, but by a private contractor who bid on arena maintenance for the year. The food was never warm, mostly hard bread, fermented fish paste, and sometimes spoiled fruits. Water came in cisterns, often stagnant. Most wardens grew used to the taste. They chewed slowly, drank sparingly, and accepted stomach illness as an occasional nuisance of the job. They did not eat with others. Meals were private affairs, taken leaning against a wall or crouched beside a resting leopard. And yet, they were never quite alone, even at their most isolated. The walls of the Hypogeum breathed with life. Footsteps, grunts, rattling chains, snores, low animal murmurs like a storm just beneath the surface, and always the sound of something dripping. No one ever knew where from, but it never stopped. One particularly worn corridor, just east of the main lift shaft, features a series of torch sockets carved directly into the stone wall, placed at exact intervals with soot so thick. In parts, it's still visible today. It's known unofficially among archaeologists as the Black Path. Some believe it was reserved for especially dangerous animals, those that couldn't be trusted even in crates. Others think it was the escape route for handlers during staged stampedes, or even the path by which corpses were removed after the shows. Whatever its purpose, what's striking is the where. The wall is smooth at shoulder height, suggesting hundreds, maybe thousands of brushings by men walking quickly through tight quarters. And here too, amid the scorched stone and dried resin, is a curious detail etched into the base of one wall. Nearly missed by the earliest excavators is a single word, Miminai. I remember. No signature, no date, just the quiet acknowledgement. Memory inside a place built for forgetting. To work in the Hypogeum was to live between lives. You saw men before they became legends, and you saw animals before they became stories. You saw hope before it was erased, and rage before it was weaponized. But you yourself were not recorded. The wardens weren't buried in rich tomes. Their names didn't appear in amphitheater archives. Most likely, they died of simple things: fever, infection, exhaustion, and when they did, someone else took their keys, folded their cloak, and walked their corridor. The Colosseum continued, unaware, because the Colosseum needed its beasts and its blood. It needed its marble steps and its painted shields, but it also needed its silence, its waiting, its fear, and the men who carried that silence in their shoulders, who walked through waiting and fear, night after night. They were not warriors. They were not slaves. They were not saints. They were simply forgotten. But the walls remember. The stones still echo with the rhythm of their steps. Even now, you stand in the Hypogeum when no one else is there. Feel it, the absence of the men who kept things moving. It's by not moving at all. The final days of the Hypogeum were not announced with ceremony. There was no decree nailed to a door. No horn sounded through the arches. There was just slow forgetting. By the end of the 5th century, the spectacles had dulled. Gladiators were no longer the heroes of Roman imagination, and the beasts once shipped from Africa with great fanfare now arrived less frequently. Their passage across the Mediterranean made dangerous by pirate raids and failing infrastructure. The wardens remained for a time, not because they were needed in the same way, but because places like the Hypogeum don't let go of people easily. Habits formed in darkness are the slowest to die. A document dated to around 435 CE, discovered centuries later among the Acta Urbis, a kind of civic record of Rome, references a man of graying beard who still oils the hinges of the under arena rooms, though no beast has stirred there in 12 years. It is not known who this man was, but the record goes on to say that when asked why he continued to perform his tasks, he responded simply, because the doors still close. Even when the world above changed, even when emperors lost crowns, and churches gained ground, Latin itself began to shift under the weight of newer tongues. He kept walking the corridor. What did he see? This unnamed final warden. Not the lions and leopards of his youth, not the sweating crowds and coin tosses, but shadows where torches once burned. He may have heard the scuff of rats where once men prayed before death. Perhaps he passed his hand along the smooth grooves in the stone, remembering the others who had stood in that very spot by then. Even the water cisterns had gone dry. Clay jars cracked from disuse. The oil lamps were burned black. Still, he walked, not because anyone was watching, but because he had. Watched men cry, watched animals thrash against the gates, watched the shadows of Rome stretch across the floor like spilled wine at dusk. Too late would be to let all of that vanish. And so he stayed, until the day he didn't, when archaeologists first began proper excavation of the Hypogeum in the 19th century. After centuries of ruin, burial, and weathering, they found many things buried in the earth: fragments of wood, animal bones, discarded sandals, rusted keys. One key in particular drew quiet attention. It was larger than most, longer than a man's palm, heavy with corrosion. Its teeth were hand-filed, uneven, possibly reworked several times, and etched faintly along its iron neck were the letters DM. No one knows what the letters mean. Theories have included Domus, Memoria, Rerum, House of Remembered, Dings, Dies, Mortis, Rescripta, the day of death, rewritten, or simply initials, a man's name. Someone who had no other record but this. The key didn't match any known lock above ground. Not in the emperor's chambers, not in the gatehouses, not in the temples nearby, but in the Hypogeum, in one corridor sealed by a collapsed stone wall. A lock mechanism was found, oddly sized, and the teeth fit. The door itself no longer stood. The lock had rusted so badly that it cracked open like a fossil under pressure inside the chamber. Nothing of value by ancient standards, but to historians, it was everything. 3 folded tunics, sun-faded, a small bench, and a wall covered in scratched, marking scorched strokes, counted in groups of 5, not numbers, not names, names, just time. Hundreds of tallied days, maybe years, and beneath the last set, carved deeper than the rest, were 4 words. I waited, no one came. You begin to realize, the deeper you go, that Rome wasn't just made by emperors. It wasn't just the battlefield that shaped the world, the Senate that wrote the laws. It was also the hands that opened doors that no one saw, the feet that walked corridors for decades, never expecting to be remembered. It was also the wardens, the keepers of things, forgotten before they were even finished. The men who fed the animals, who cleaned the cages, who sharpened the chains, and soothed the wounded, who knew how the blood flowed beneath the sand and how long it took to be scrubbed away. Men who had no audience, no biographies, no funerary statues, just the echo of their steps and the tools they left behind. And perhaps that is the most Roman thing of all. Not the conquest, not the marble, not the grandeur, but the quiet insistence that a thing should be done. Even if no one will see it, even if the world above forgets, even if the sun never reaches you, you keep the door oiled, you keep the corridor clear, you keep the beasts from biting through their ropes, not because you will be rewarded, but because someone must, because the machine only works when all the invisible parts continue their invisible roles, and when those roles end, they do not vanish, they settle, deep beneath the stone, where no one looks, but where history breathes anyway. Today, as tourists walk the Hypogeum, they marvel at the lift shafts, the trapdoors, the cages. They listen to guides speak of engineering and cruelty, politics and power. but the walls say more. They say nothing. And that is how you know someone once listened. Someone once waited. Someone once lived a life down there, doing the work that history forgets, so that the parts it remembers could shine, even if only for a moment, even if only above the ground. The Colosseum is not where you expect to find water, not the kind that trickles quietly beneath the floor, dark and tepid and persistent, not the kind that curls around stone pillars and stains brick with a quiet, soft-dreamed bloom. But if you stood inside the Colosseum around the year 112 CE, when the games were still a national institution, when Trajan ruled and the crowd still roared with bloodlust, you might have noticed something strange. A smell, not the obvious one: sweat, damp straw, sunburned flesh, or wet animals in cages. Those were part of the expected tapestry. This was different. A sour dampness with an edge of rot, the kind of scent that doesn't rise from blood or bodies or beasts, but from somewhere deeper, below the sand, beneath the stone, through the bones of the structure itself. Few paid it much attention. After all, the Colosseum was not built for its scent. It was built for spectacle, Renawide dramas, and the mechanical roars of its subterranean ingenuity. And in that time, there was so much movement, so much death, and noise, and heat, that no one lingered long enough to question slight mustiness in the air. But the slaves noticed it, the ones who worked the Hypogeum, who pulled ropes and opened gates, who cleaned the blood off trapdoors, who fed the leopards raw scraps behind locked grills. They felt the dampness through their soles. They knew which corridors grew slick at night, even when the day had been dry. Some of them developed strange skin boils on their legs. Others coughed in the darker corners, where the air felt heavier than it should in an open structure. And the engineers, quiet, clever, visible, began to whisper. Water was not supposed to be there. Not here. Not like this. Not in the heart of a structure built to defy nature with precision. And yet, it was Rome was, paradoxically, both the master of water and its most helpless subject. Aqueducts carried crystal ribbons across valleys and arches. Fountains bubbled in courtyards. The baths of Caracalla, of Diocletian, of Nero, they were triumphs of plumbing and pressure. Rome knew how to move water, but it did not always know how to stop it. The Colosseum sat on land that once held a shallow, artificial lake, constructed under Emperor Nero for his Domus Aureate, the Golden House. That lake had been drained to make way for the amphitheater, but the earth underneath remembered. It held moisture like a grudge. Below the Colosseum's foundations, clay and sediment met in a tangled, unpredictable mess. Somewhere in that mess, water still moved. It didn't gush or flood not in the dramatic fashion of overflowing rivers or aqueduct failures. Instead, it seeped, silently, softly, persistently. And because no one was allowed to admit that something as magnificent as the Colosseum could have flaws, the water was allowed to linger. One document, preserved in a marginal note of an architectural treatise by Vitruvius, though most scholars believe it was added by a later reader, mentions the following. A servant of the lower levels reports a sound like weeping under the floor, not from men, not from beasts. The stones themselves seem to weep. This poetic exaggeration likely referred to the slow drip of water down stone pillars, an echoing trickle amplified by the closed concave architecture of the Hypogeum. It was described again, centuries later, in letters from early Christian visitors who believed the Colosseum was haunted not by souls, but by nature reclaiming man's arrogance. And, over time, the evidence became harder to ignore. The metal began to rust faster in certain areas. Doors swelled in their frames, and in the driest months of summer, when the Tiber narrowed and the fountains lost pressure, there were still puddles underground. In the Colosseum, water was coming from inside the earth. Maintenance records from the early 3rd century CE mentioned a team of structors, subterranean underground workers, being assigned not to the machinery of lifts or gates, but to drainage and foul waters. Their task was not glamorous. They were not the stagehands of spectacle, nor the craftsmen of wood and wheel. They were the ones who crawled through waste tunnels with torches and wax tablets. Mapping the moisture, they discovered something unexpected. A well, small, crudely lined with irregular bricks. No mosaic, no inscription. Hidden behind a partial collapse in a corridor that wasn't on any official map of the arena's design. The workers who found it believed it was older than the Colosseum, perhaps older than Nero, perhaps even older than the lake itself. What it fed, no one knew. It was too deep to drain and too narrow to climb. The shaft went down into the earth and never echoed. Stones dropped in, didn't splash, they just vanished. And that frightened them more than they admitted. So the well was sealed, B-R-I-C-K-E-D, over hastily, without ceremony. Not because it was a danger in the traditional sense, but because it was anomalous. It didn't fit the plan. It wasn't drawn on the blueprints. It was a quiet mystery. And in Rome, quiet mysteries were things to be buried. The smell persisted. In the decades that followed, new engineers came and went. Some were hired to expand the Hypogeum, others simply to maintain its aging systems. A few of them kept private records notes scrawled in wax tablets or scratched into the margins of architectural scrolls. One such note, dated to around 246 CE, reads, "The corridor beneath the east lift remains damp, even in drought. I have scraped the stones 3 times. Each time the white crust returns. Salt, mold, something from deeper strata, and another. 2 servants refused to work the lower chambers, said they saw water run uphill. We don't know what that last note meant. Perhaps it was a trick of the Aja reflection, a hallucination in low torchlight. Or perhaps they had simply watched condensation bead along stone in a strange pattern. Still, word spread. Servants told each other stories of cursed water, of spirits trapped in wells, of Nero's ghost bleeding into the foundations, and slowly, superstition crept in where reason had no answers. It wasn't until centuries later, long after the games had ended, long after the Colosseum had been looted for stone, turned into a fortress, then a ruin, then a shrine, that the mystery of the water returned in 1938, during Mussolini's campaign to reassert Roman grandeur. A team of archaeologists was allowed to conduct deeper studies of the Hypogeum. Among their many discoveries, wooden pulleys, animal remains, graffiti. They also found an unexplained damp patch in a sealed corridor. No plumbing led there. No recent rain could explain it, and when they chipped away the stone, they found the bricks of a wall that looked older than the arena itself. Behind it, a vertical shaft, narrow, lined in bricks, warped by centuries. The well, still there, still moist, still bottomless samples were taken. The water, oddly, showed no signs of surface contamination, no runoff from the Tiber, no match with nearby aquifers. It seemed to come from nowhere, or rather from somewhere deeper. Today, the well is still sealed. The section of the Hypogeum where it lies is marked as structurally unstable. Tourists are not allowed there. Only archaeologists with special clearance may study it, and even then, most avoid it. Not because they believe in ghosts or curses, but because it should not be. Because the Colosseum is mapped, measured, mastered, and yet, here, beneath all that order, something remains unexplained. A water that arrives from nowhere. A presence that softens stone and rusts iron even now. A silent, persistent reminder that even the might of Rome could not command everything. Not the ground beneath its feet, not the past beneath its monuments, not the water that flows, slow and uninvited, under stone, The trouble with ancient water was not that it was visible, it was that it refused to be noticed until it was already everywhere. When water behaves predictably, when it flows through stone-cut channels, when it fills a cistern on command, when it sprays upward in a fountain that sings the praises of a generous emperor, then it is seen as proof of Roman genius. But when it appears uninvited through cracks in imperial foundations, it becomes something far more disturbing. Not a failure of plumbing, but a betrayal of stone. By the 3rd century CE, the Colosseum's substructure had become a complex, moody machine. Its lifts, gates, holding pens, and trapdoors all relied on human muscle and basic mechanics. Lubricated with animal fat and coarse oil, water had no place in these systems. Too much moisture swelled the wood, rusted the hinges, softened the ropes, and caked the sand into heavy sludge. And yet across decades and dynasties, the same quiet signs kept returning. Salt crystals blooming at the base of pillars, damp footprints left in places no one had stepped, slippery walls and corridors no one cleaned, and engineers loyal servants of the empire. Men trained in logic and stone were increasingly called not to build, but to explain. They struggled. The Roman approach to architectural problems was thorough, but deeply hierarchical. When a problem was identified, it passed through layers of interpretation, from laborer to overseer, from overseer to clerk, and then, if it was serious enough, to the appointed engineer. But problems that did not interrupt the games were rarely considered serious. And the water, for all its quiet persistence, did not delay the games, so the engineers worked around it. In 219 CE, minor functionary named Aurelius Basianus, appointed as curator munerarum subterranearum, a kind of overseer of underground spectacles, compiled a private list of complaints from the subrostani, the underground workers. This list survives only in fragments, copied into the personal diary of a later maintenance chief who found it wedged behind a collapsed lintel, repeated swelling of north gate timbers, unexplained puddles in bestiary cage corridor, mold forming in torch alcoves despite heat, chalk lines drawn to trace seepage, erased by morning. Basianus tried to address the issues without drawing attention upward. He ordered fresh brickwork in known trouble spots. He had sand replaced twice monthly. He even instructed workers to sleep in the dampest tunnels during festival weeks, reasoning that human presence encourages dryness. It didn't work. The problems returned, quietly and without respect for schedule. What was worse, the water began to change things. Over time, bricks that had once been sharp and dry took on a soft edge. Limestone began to flake. Iron locks jammed unpredictably. Torches sputtered in spaces that had no airflow problems before. Workers whispered that the Colosseum was sweating, and the term stuck. Official documents, for the first time, began referring to the issue not as a structural concern, but as a condition. The Colosseum, they said, had developed a moist temperament, not a flaw, a personality, a superstition, perhaps, but one born of observation. A young maintenance apprentice named Hilarius reportedly refused to enter the Eastern Service corridor alone, convinced that he could hear the walls breathe. His overseer beat him for cowardice. The next morning, the corridor was found flooded up to the ankle with water that had no obvious source, and Hilarius, oddly, was promoted to an administrative post. Some engineers began to note curious inconsistencies. One wall that had been perfectly dry during morning rounds would be coated in condensation by nightfall. A trapdoor that had opened smoothly for months would suddenly seize without cause, only to release on its own 2 days later. And on more than one occasion, light rains outside seemed to cause flooding inside. A theory was whispered among the more experienced builders. The Colosseum wasn't leaking from above, was filling from beneath. Rome's relationship with groundwater was always fraught. though the aqueducts were the public face of Roman water. Okay. The city's foundations rested on a complicated underworld of natural springs, silt beds, and ancient Etruscan drainage channels. Some of these predated the Forum. Others had long since been lost to history, buried, repurposed, or collapsed, and somewhere in that forgotten web, the Colosseum had put down roots. An ambitious survey was ordered in 233 CE under Emperor Severus Alexander. It aimed to chart all subterranean waterways in the Colosseum district. The project, led by a respected hydraulic engineer named Gaius Petronius Laurentius, was given 16 months and an entire cohort of slaves. The results were incomplete, but revealing at least 4 undocumented channels ran beneath the arena, none aligned with the known sewer routes. One of them, called simply the Western Vein, in the report appeared to originate beneath the arena itself. Laurentius, ever careful, did not offer conclusions, but his marginal notes included the phrase, possibly pre-Romulan origin. The implications were deeply uncomfortable. If true, it meant that something older than Rome had once flowed beneath the Colosseum. The games continued. The crowds screamed. The sand was stained and swept and stained again. But beneath all that, the engineers worked like silent priests, tending to a god they didn't understand. New techniques were tried. The opus signanema, waterproof plaster of crushed tiles and lime, was applied liberally to corridors and floors. Drainage pits were deepened. Ventilation was expanded in the hope that airflow might slow the damp. For a time, things seemed better. Then the mold came back stronger, stranger. In 261 CE, a clerk named Arianus recorded an incident in which 3 lions, held in an eastern cage for the Venetians, refused to emerge through the trapdoor. They growled at the floor and backed away, even under prodding. One clawed at the wall, as if trying to escape something below. After the event, the holding area was inspected and found to be perfectly dry. But 2 days later, salt blooms reappeared on the cage floor, white, crystalline, cold to the touch. The lions had sensed it before the engineers did. By the late 3rd century, no one expected to solve the water problem. Instead, they adjusted timber for the arena's substructure was pre-treated with oil and wax. Trapdoor mechanisms were rebuilt using bronze instead of iron, less vulnerable to rust. Workers assigned to the Hypogeum were rotated out every 40 days to avoid illness, and new recruits were given strict instructions: never remove bricks from sealed shafts, never descend any well that wasn't drawn on the wall map, never question where the moisture comes from, only where it goes. In a sense, the water had become part of the Colosseum's identity, not an intruder, a resident, a slow, pulsing reminder that Rome was not eternal, not in the way marble pretended it was. Beneath every triumph, beneath every roar, beneath the sand and the myth, there was always something damp, something old, something ignored. Water, after all, has no empire. It flows until it finds a way. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Colosseum had begun to sink in places. This subsidence was long attributed to earthquakes or stone theft, but recent core samples suggest that soil erosion from underground moisture may have played a larger role. And when archaeologists in the 20th century reopened parts of the Hypogeum for study, they were shocked to discover that some chambers sealed for over 1,000 years were still wet, despite modern Rome above, despite centuries of sun, despite time. The water was still there, moving, waiting, waiting. By the time Rome's emperors had lost their crowns and their gods had lost their names, the Colosseum was still standing, but it wasn't quite itself. The games had ended. The imperial treasury no longer issued funds for spectacles. The underground lifts stopped creaking. The roar of lions gave way to the quiet hiss of wind winding through empty corridors. And underneath all this silence, the water stayed. The Colosseum, like much of ancient Rome, adapted slowly to the new world forming around it. It was too large to ignore, too symbolic to destroy, and too inconvenient to fully repurpose. Bit by bit, it changed. During the 5th century, squatters moved into the lower vaults, building makeshift homes from broken marble and timber stolen from abandoned villas. They cooked near the old service corridors, hung cloth from bronze hooks meant for gladiators, and slept beside ancient drains. But they noticed the same things that Roman engineers had noted centuries before. The floors were wet when it hadn't rained. The walls glistened at dawn. And in some corners, a kind of slow, warm fog hung in place, especially around the sealed wells. They told stories, not about ghosts, not exactly, but about water that could whisper, about bricks that sweated like flesh, about animals that wouldn't pass through certain archways, and always about a well that no one had opened, but that sometimes made a sound, as if something in it was still moving. It's important to understand what these wells were. Most were not wells in the traditional sense, not carved deep for drawing drinking water. Instead, they were vertical shafts, some lined with stone, others rock-cut through soil, created for ventilation, drainage, or the rare and complicated practice of underground animal handling. Some were capped by wooden frames. Others had simply been bricked, overclosed in haste, without record. During maintenance cycles, long-forgotten archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered nearly 34 such shafts beneath the Colosseum. Many were choked with debris, but a few were eerily clean, as if something had continued to flow through them long after their original use had ceased. One, near the northeastern quadrant of the Hypogeum, ran 11 meters straight down, lined with old lime plaster and fitted with 3 separate catchment basins. At the bottom, the excavation team found something unexpected. Not water, not sludge, but a copper ladle, still upright, resting in fine sand. No wooden bucket, no rope, just the ladle, perfectly balanced. There was no record of such a shaft being used for drawing water, and yet the evidence suggested someone had tried, or perhaps something had tried to offer, throughout the early medieval period. The Colosseum became a kind of architectural afterthought, sometimes a fortress, sometimes a quarry, sometimes a market. Yet, beneath the surface, in the lower vaults that no one fully mapped, the strange water continued to rise and fall. In the year 847, an earthquake devastated parts of Rome. Much of the Colosseum's southern side collapsed. The Cala masonry slid into alleyways. Archways tilted. For weeks afterward, displaced residents noted that water began pouring from broken floors in the Hypogeum. Not dripping, not oozing, pouring. Theories abounded. Some said an aqueduct had burst underground. Others insisted it was punishment for turning a place of glory into a barnyard for goats. One monk, writing anonymously from a nearby basilica, described the event this way. It was as if the bones of the beast had broken, and now the blood of the old gods was spilling through. The water subsided, but the stain remained to this day in the modern concrete restorations built to support foot traffic for tourists. Preservation teams monitor humidity with delicate sensors. One section, just beneath the reconstructed elevator platform still, shows unexplained spikes in moisture. There are no pipes nearby, no modern leaks, yet the readings climb and then fall, without pattern, almost like tides, but not of the sea. In 1998, a group of structural engineers were brought in to assess the long-term stability of the Colosseum's lower levels. Their report, which remains partially unpublished, noted subsurface anomalies suggestive of historical groundwater reservoirs or uncharted Roman drainage faults. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a hollow zone beneath the arena floor, roughly circular, almost 5 meters across. with no clear access route. Some wanted to excavate, others hesitated. Funding was delayed. Permits expired. And eventually, the proposal was shelved. To this day, that hollow remains sealed. No camera has seen inside. So what do we know? We know that Rome was built on shifting, silty ground. That its engineers tried desperately, repeatedly, to contain what flowed beneath their monuments. That water, always the invisible enemy, seeped into everything over centuries. We also know this. Most of the Colosseum's original drainage blueprints are missing. Some parts of the Hypogeum have never been fully surveyed. And the system of sealed wells, those strange, vertical shafts, capped and forgotten remains, poorly understood. Even the modern restoration crews, working with lasers and LiDAR, regularly find unmapped channels, sudden soft spots in the stone, or ancient mineral trails leading nowhere. One restoration worker, interviewed in 2007, said, "We cleaned out a service arch and found a kind of slime, trailload, dry but unmistakably leading straight into a wall. The wall wasn't on our blueprint. We tapped it. Hollow. No door, no crack. Just wall. We left it." Another recounted, "There are cold spots down there. It's a kind that don't move with air. Just linger." And perhaps most strangely, sensors left running in one unused tunnel recorded a low-frequency hum, audible to the human ear but captured on equipment. It lasted for almost 17 minutes. No external cause was ever found. Why does this matter? Because the Colosseum is not just a monument. It is a living ruin. It's a shell that has been shaped and reshaped by time, weather, empire, and decay. The games may be gone, the spectators silent, but the ground beneath has never stopped shifting, and water eternally patient. It's possibly persistent may still be reshaping it. Perhaps not in ways we notice, not yet, but when you stand above that ancient floor or peer through the graded walkways to the vaults below, you are not just looking at history. You're looking at something still happening, something that never stopped, something that refuses to dry. So, what was the water beneath the Colosseum? A flaw? A ghost? A geological inevitability? Or was it something stranger, some final echo of the city's buried past, a silent resistance against the idea that Rome was ever in control? The answers, if they exist, are still sealed somewhere down there beneath the floor. There are many ways to close a building. Some are loud, official, and final sealed with declarations. Keys turned in locks, arches bricked shut for all to see. But others are quieter, fainter, the sort of closure that isn't about locking the doors, but about forgetting who once walked through them. This story begins not with a gate clanging shut, but with a tablet. Not a Roman tablet made of stone, nor a wax tablet with names scratched in with a stylus. This one was wooden pine, likely reused found in a pile of refuse near what used to be the entrance to the Hypogeum, the underfloor labyrinth of the Colosseum. The wood had darkened with centuries of moisture, and only a few lines of writing remained visible. But what stood out was not what was there, but what wasn't. Because nowhere on that ledger of closing inventory was there a single name. No gladiators, no beastmasters, no slave handlers, physicians, or trainers. Just crates, weights, tights, hinges, and an entry marked simply arena floor, rolled back, storage, covered. No further need. It was the last known itemized inventory of the Colosseum's functional equipment, and it said absolutely nothing about the people. By the 6th century CE, the Colosseum was a ghost of itself. The Roman Empire, as it had once been understood, no longer existed. Its center had shifted to Constantinople. The senators who once sat in marble rows now served under Gothic warlords, or retreated into religious service. The sand of the arena had stopped soaking blood and started catching dust, and somewhere in that slow, bureaucratic unraveling of the Western Empire, Someone was tasked with closing the books. It wasn't dramatic. There was no last gladiator chained at the gate, no final lion roaring into the night. It was likely a clerk-attired man with bad sandals and a reed pen walking room to room with a sheet of parchment, recording what could be repurposed, what was to be stored, and what could be safely forgotten. He probably didn't even notice what was missing: names, faces, histories, the men who had died there in Rome. Ledgers were everything. From the height of empire, the Romans cataloged every expense, every slave, every tunic distributed to the crowd. Okay? They knew how many bags of sand were delivered for the arena. Okay? How many skewers of meat were sold during intermissions? How many coins were dropped into the offering bowls before each bloodletting? But by the time this final ledger was written, the bureaucracy was brittle. The municipal archives had been burned and moved and burned again. The offices of the curators responsible for public works had been shuttered. The marble plaques bearing names of victors had crumbled or been stolen for lime dot. And so the last record we have of the arena in use is not a celebration, it's a clearance list. What it tells us is haunting in its dullness. Rows of iron rings, 2 broken winches, a cart with 1 wheel missing, 3 bundles of frayed rope, 1 water basin, cracked, a box of wooden pegs labeled Panther Platform. There is something disconcerting about the specificity. It's easy to forget that an empire dies in the mundane, not with armies collapsing, but with equipment rusting, with job titles losing meaning, with scribes copying lists they don't understand. And this list, the final inventory, was one such document. We do not know who compiled it, only that it was placed with other debris, as if its own relevance had expired the moment it was written. There is a common myth that the Colosseum was closed by decree, by a righteous emperor, or a Christian priest, or a sudden moment of moral clarity. But in truth, it was economics. The city couldn't afford the games anymore. The beasts were harder to import. The taxes were failing, and the administrative class that used to run such spectacles had either died, converted, or fled. What once required 100 clerks, 24 engineers, and hundreds of support staff, now had no one to oversee it, and so, one winter morning, perhaps damp, perhaps cloudy, a man with a pen walked the echoing halls of an arena built for 50,000 and made a list. He called it complete. He signed it at the bottom with 2 words, consignatum est. It is consigned. But what of the gladiators? Surely someone remembered them. The men who died under sunlight and cheers. The men who trained in Ludus Magnus, whose bones were swept away beneath the floor, whose breath hung heavy in the warm morning before a fight. Surely someone preserved their names. But the ledger says nothing. And that's the strange, this echoing silence at the heart of this story. Because while tombstones and graffiti and poems still reference individual fighters, Spiculus, Flamma, Priscus, none of them are mentioned in this final record. It is as if they were deliberately erased from the building's memory. Only the tools remained in modern times. Historians and archaeologists have combed through the ruins of the Colosseum looking for evidence of final use, and curiously, they find less about people and more about things: tools, fixtures, doors, and ledgers, like this one. One particular item on the list, translated as folding platform, slotted, appears to have been used to transport wounded men to the edge of the arena without being lifted manually. It had no name attached to it, no notes about repairs or history, just folding, slatted, stored. But what stories it could have told. How many groaning bodies had been rolled on it? How many final breaths had darkened its grain? It sat, unused, for decades till the inventory marked it for salvage. It was likely taken apart for firewood. There is, in the silence of the Colosseum's closing, a kind of sadness that is easy to overlook. the sadness of forgetting, not in the dramatic sense, but in the bureaucratic, in the space where names should have been. There were objects, where legacies should have been preserved. There were categories, hooks, crates, ropes. It's possible that the clerk didn't even think about the men who had once gripped those ropes, or the blood that had soaked the sand beneath the folding platform, or the screams that once echoed from the corridors where he now walked, calmly checking locks. He saw only things, and perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Empire, at its end, didn't want to remember. Perhaps, having shifted into a new age of Christ, of bishops, of crumbling borders, it was easier to forget the noise of the old gods, to pretend the sand had never been read, to pretend the cheers had never risen, to list the weights and not the men. So what do we do with a ledger like this? We could call it dull, just another archaeological footnote, or we could see it for what it truly is, a death certificate for memory, an official act of forgetting, a quiet, final moment when the arena stopped being a place of stories and started being a pile of parts. It's easy to think that history ends with a bang, but sometimes it ends with a list, If you return to the Colosseum today, and you walk slowly not as a tourist snapping photos, but as someone looking for something lost, you may notice something peculiar beneath your feet. The floor is long gone, replaced by walkways and platforms for modern access, but beneath those, stone corridors still stretch in forgotten angles. Dust rests thick on cracked stones and metal beams, added in later centuries, interrupt the harmony of Roman design. What is gone, however, is the sense of purpose, because once those corridors lived, they echoed not just with the roar of lions or the clatter of weapons, but with the rustle of inventory scrolls. Each hallway had a designation, each room a number. When the Colosseum was at its peak, it was not merely a theater of violence, it was a feat of logistics, a place where gladiators, wild beasts, tools, and props all had to arrive in the correct order, at the correct hour, through the correct entrance, and behind that choreography was paperwork. Thousands of records, most now gone, but the few that survived chart fragments, faded notes, a final ledger reveal, an empire obsessed with control. The Romans wanted to know where everything was, every box, every bolt, every drop of oil, and, ideally, every man. But the final ledger, that fading pine tablet buried in the dust near the Hypogeum's edge, did not follow that rule. It listed everything except people, and perhaps that was no accident. The clerk who wrote I-10 known, unremarkable, was likely not new to the arena. His writing hand, tight and practiced, suggests experience. He abbreviated properly. A T he used standard imperial shorthand, K, and he grouped the objects in useful categories: transport, restraints, lifting apparatus, staging, rigging, K, and so forth. But as you read it line after line, you begin to realize something is missing, not just in content, but in attitude. There is no care, no reflection, no sign that this was once a place of meaning. One entry reads, crate, reinforced, slats missing, contents, unknown, heavy, location, northwest tunnel. No attempt was made to open it. No one seemed to care what was inside. Another note, pulley station, rusted. Rope remnants suggest animal lift, decommissioned. No record of what animals. No note about repairs, it's just decommissioned. It is, at times, like reading the afterthoughts of an exhausted empire, and yet, what was being erased? If we step back and look not just at the Colosseum, but the empire in its 6th century twilight, we begin to understand. Rome, by then, was a fractured memory. The empire's administrative strength had shifted east to Constantinople. Italy had suffered waves of invasions from Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths leaving urban centers like Rome struggling for resources. Infrastructure fell into disrepair. Roads became dangerous. Trade routes shrank. The Colosseum, once surrounded by markets and public baths, now sat like a fossil in a changing world. Worse still, Christianity had changed the city's moral architecture. By the 5th century, the church was rising in power, and with it came a new attitude toward entertainment. Bloodsport was seen as pagan cruelty. Gladiators were no longer heroes or cautionary tales. They were shameful relics of a sinful past. The sand that once thrilled audiences was now remembered with distaste. And so the Colosseum didn't just fall into disuse, it was deliberately forgotten. This explains why the final ledger feels sterile, because perhaps it was meant to be. Imagine being that clerk, walking through the corridors, writing down numbers, recording hinges and chains in unmarked crates, consciously. Or not that your job wasn't just to count, but to conclude that the names you were leaving out were being left out for a reason. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was difference. Maybe it was instruction. We don't know. But we do know that from this moment forward, chords of the arena become more fragmented. Later documents refer to the structure only in terms of salvage, where to take stone for churches, where to retrieve iron clamps for other buildings. The Colosseum was no longer a place to gather crowds, but a convenient quarry, and with every stone taken, a little more history vanished. There is a legend, though no record survives to confirm it, that the Bishop of Rome at one point declared the Colosseum a place unfit for memory. Whether or not that's true, the attitude seems accurate, because memory, for an empire in decline, becomes dangerous. To remember the Colosseum as it once was would have meant confronting what it had cost. Thousands of lives, rivers of blood, the import of wild animals from across continents, the exploitation of conquered peoples for sport. And so, the clerks, the priests, and the later medieval masons who came to disassemble the building all participated, consciously or not, in a process of forgetting. It's why that final ledger feels so empty, because it was never about closing a building. It was about closing a chapter of Compton. Memory. There is one curious entry near the end of the list. Faint, nearly rubbed out. It reads, storage room, west padlock, rusted through. Items not inventoried. Door wedged, left closed. The room is not described. No attempt was made to open it. No tools fetched. No pry bars. No chisel. Just left closed. We do not know what was inside. Perhaps it was empty. Perhaps it wasn't. But in that simple, bureaucratic dismissal, we find the entire spirit of the final ledger. An unwillingness to look too deeply. A desire not to ask, as if by leaving the door shut, one could avoid what it might contain: memories, bones, costumes, weapons, or just silence. Whatever it was, the scribe didn't want to know, and neither, it seems, did the empire. So what do we do now? We who stand centuries later, peering into this vast skeleton of a stadium, trying to piece together what was lost. We could lament the erasure. We could wish for better records, more names, more accounts of those last quiet years. But perhaps it's more instructive to notice how forgetting works. Not with fire, not with war, but with lists, with routine, with padlocks left unopened. And perhaps in your own life, in your own world, there are ledgers being written right now, of inventory, but of relevance, of what is remembered, of what is quietly allowed to fade. And that's the unsettling lesson of this story. History can disappear, not because no one wrote it down, but because someone did and chose what not to say. The Colosseum never formally closed. No decree was nailed to its gates. No priest declared the arena cursed. No emperor stood to announce the end of the games. Instead, the building exhaled slowly over centuries, its corridors hollowing out, its timbers crumbling, its sand thickening with time. And as the empire that built it lost its grasp on power, its ability to maintain a narrative slipped away to dot, so the Colosseum faded, not with thunder, but with inventory, and in the final ledger, dry, mechanical, almost careless, we can read that fading not as drama, but as process. It's tempting to think of this ledger as an ending, but in truth, it was more like the stillness after a storm. Not just an account of what was left, but a record of what had already vanished. A document that didn't so much record history as quietly declare what would not be remembered. And perhaps the most telling detail of all was what the ledger called the place. It didn't say Colosseum. It didn't say Amphitheatrum Flavium either. Original name under Emperor Vespas. No in the headings. Mall, inked by a careful but aging hand, simply read, Magazzino Vecchio, the old warehouse. It's hard to overstate what that means. By the 6th or 7th century, the greatest monument to Rome's imperial entertainment wasn't even seen as a theater anymore. Not a civic structure, not a sacred relic, just a convenient place to store things, a building with dry space and many rooms. No different, really, from a barn or a storeroom, except taller, rounder, and made of stone. And in this warehouse, no gladiators were named. The final ledger, spread across 3 warped wooden boards, listed over 280 items: oil jars, nails, pulley weights, chains, tools for grooming animals, broken doors stacked for firewood, a piece of statuary labeled only as damaged torso, origin unknown. There were wheels from supply carts, scaffolding brackets, jars of pitch, and sacks of spoiled grain. But nowhere was there a name. Not a gladiator, not a prisoner, not a beast handler, not a stagehand, not even a guard. No one, even though people were surely still there, even if only a handful still walking the halls, paring hinges, noting rust, peering into dark rooms and scribbling on wooden tablets. Still, the ledger named none of them. It was as though the building had gone from being a place for people to a place without them, as though the entire human dimension had been scrubbed out, not with malice, but with the quiet disinterest that so often buries the past. We often imagine history is lost to fire, but in truth, fire is not the great enemy of memory, nor is war, nor conquest. It is disuse. When something stops being used, it stops being important. And once it stops being important, it is no longer protected, not repaired, not spoken of, not copied or recopied. So it fades. And even in the 8th or 9th century, if you were a young monk in Rome, cataloging materials for a new chapel, you might visit the Magazzino Vecchio looking for stone. You might note the smooth curve of travertine, the rust-stained holes from old iron clamps, the way light pooled under the archways. But you wouldn't necessarily think gladiators. You'd think salvage. You'd think material. And if you heard someone call it the Colosseum, you might not even connect it to the thing your ancestors once gathered to cheer at. It was just another ruin. So where did the people go? The answer lies not in a single year, but in a slow, uneven decline. The games themselves had waned under Christian emperors. By the early 5th century, gladiator schools had been repurposed or shut down. Public enthusiasm, once compulsory, was now tinged with guilt. Bishops urged citizens to withdraw. Spectacles became smaller, more local, more desperate. By 438 CE, Emperor Valentinian III banned gladiatorial combat entirely, though the law was weakly enforced. Still, even after the games stopped, the building lingered. It hosted animal hunts now and then, even flood spectacles. But fewer and fewer people came. Budgets shrank. The roar of crowds faded to the creak of ropes and the scuff of sandals on worn stone. And eventually, The people who maintained the arena began to vanish too. Some died, some moved away, some found other work: masonry, church, labor, military service, and some, perhaps, simply stopped coming. Because when something dies slowly, no one marks the day it ended. You just look up one morning and realize it's gone. That ledger, the last one we have, was found centuries later during a minor excavation in the 1800s. Its boards were split, its ink faded. For years, scholars debated whether it belonged to the Colosseum at all. But the measurements matched, the item descriptions matched ancient accounts, and most compellingly, the tone matched. A ledger that tried hard not to care. Not because the clerk lacked feeling, but because the world around him had taught him that this building no longer mattered. And in that tone, we find something achingly modern. Because how many things today are we forgetting, not with fire, not with hatred, but with quiet indifference? A language not spoken, a building not maintained, a name not recorded, a door that won't open. And so we stop trying. One final note in the ledger, barely visible beneath the others, scratched into the wood rather than written in ink, likely added hastily. It read, "All items not removed by solstice to be sealed." No signature, no indication of who gave the order, just the instruction to seal, not destroy, not inventory, not preserve. Seal, which is, perhaps, the final act of forgetting, not erasure, but silence. A silence that grew with every passing season, until the Colosseum was no longer a place of spectacle or record, but a shell with no memory of its voice. And the gladiators, unnamed in their final record, were left to disappear between the lines.